The snowstorm raged with a fury that seemed almost unnatural, each gust of wind carrying a low, guttural howl. David, a travel writer searching for secluded destinations, squinted through the icy windshield as his car's headlights struggled to pierce the endless white void. The mountain road had become a perilous path, with the icy ground threatening to pull his tires into the abyss below. The storm grew more menacing, forcing him to stop. His breath fogged up the glass as he muttered a curse, realizing he had no choice but to abandon his car and seek shelter. That's when he saw it, a faint golden light flickering in the distance, barely visible through the curtain of snow. Desperation pushed him forward, trudging through the knee-deep snow as the wind howled like a chorus of tormented souls. As he approached, the silhouette of a structure emerged, a sprawling inn atop a hill, its outline jagged and foreboding against the swirling blizzard. The wooden sign hanging at the gate creaked ominously, its faded letters spelling, Frost Hill Inn. Asterisk beneath the name, an inscription had been scratched out, leaving only jagged marks as if clawed away by something unhuman. David hesitated at the threshold. The inn's appearance was unsettling, its architecture mismatched, as though built by many hands over many decades, each more careless than the last. Frost clung to its windows, forming grotesque patterns that resembled faces, distorted, anguished faces. The heavy oak door groaned open with an unnatural sound, and the sudden warmth inside felt suffocating rather than comforting. The lobby was dimly lit by a grand chandelier that swung slightly, though there was no breeze to move it. The air carried a strange metallic tang, and the smell of burned wood lingered, like the aftermath of a fire long extinguished. Furniture lay scattered as if hastily abandoned, yet the room bore no signs of decay. It felt preserved, trapped in an eerie stasis. "Welcome," a voice rasped, startling David. At the counter stood an old man, his face obscured by shadows cast by the flickering flames of a nearby hearth. His milky eyes locked onto David, unblinking. "You've come at the perfect time," the man continued, his tone dripping with an unsettling calm. David opened his mouth to speak but froze as he noticed something, a faint shadow that didn't belong to the man. It stretched unnaturally across the room, bending and twisting like it had a life of its own. Other guests occupied the lobby, or so it seemed. A woman sat in a chair by the fire, knitting something incomprehensible, a tangled mess of thread that unraveled as quickly as she stitched it. Her lips moved in silent conversation with no one. A child's laughter echoed faintly from the upper floors, though the stairs leading upward were cloaked in darkness. Every few seconds, David caught movement in his peripheral vision, but whenever he turned, nothing was there. The old man gestured toward a key resting on the counter, its brass surface oddly polished despite the dust coating everything else. "Your room awaits," he said, his smile widening just a fraction too much. David's hand trembled as he took the key, its coldness biting into his skin. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but the storm outside offered no salvation. As he climbed the stairs, their wooden boards creaked like the groans of a dying creature. The second floor was darker than the lobby, with only faint sconces casting long, quivering shadows along the narrow corridor. His room was at the far end. As he approached, a chill that had nothing to do with the storm enveloped him. The door to his room stood ajar, revealing a sliver of the interior. Inside, something shifted, too fast for him to register fully. David pushed the door open cautiously. The room was unnervingly pristine, its furnishings untouched by time. A four-poster bed with heavy velvet drapes dominated the space, and a single window overlooked the storm outside. Yet, as he stepped inside, he felt it immediately. He was not alone. A low creak came from the wardrobe in the corner, its door slightly ajar. The shadows inside seemed to ripple, as though alive. David's breath caught as a faint whisper brushed past his ear, a voice he didn't recognize, but one that sounded as though it knew him intimately. "You shouldn't have come," it murmured, before dissolving into the silence. The storm outside howled louder, yet inside the room, an even deeper chill settled over him. He locked the door, but the faint scratching that began on the other side promised no safety. David sat on the edge of the bed, his breath visible in the icy air that somehow permeated the room despite the heavy velvet curtains. He couldn't shake the unsettling sensation that the room was watching him, its walls alive with unspoken memories. His fingers brushed against the key in his pocket. The brass felt unnaturally warm, pulsating faintly, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. As he tried to rationalize the events unfolding, his gaze drifted toward the wardrobe, now silent but still slightly ajar. The darkness inside seemed impenetrable, almost thicker than the shadows cast by the dim light of the bedside lamp. As he stared, something glinted beneath the wardrobe door, a metallic object, small but distinct. David hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave it alone, but his curiosity, mixed with a morbid sense of dread, drove him to his knees. Reaching out cautiously, he retrieved the object. It was a locket, its delicate chain tangled and rusted. The front bore an intricate engraving of a snowflake, eerily similar to the frost patterns on the inn's windows. David opened the locket with trembling hands, revealing a faded photograph inside. The image was black and white, depicting a young woman with hauntingly familiar eyes. His chest tightened as he realized why. Those were his mother's eyes. But the woman in the photograph was far younger than his mother had ever been in his memory, and her expression was blank, almost lifeless. Beneath the photo, etched into the delicate metal, was a name, Elena Frost. The name hit him like a cold wind. Memories he couldn't place began to surface, fragmented images of his childhood winters, his mother's distant stares whenever snow fell heavily, and the way she would hum a strange tune that never seemed to have an ending. He hadn't thought about it in years, but now the melody returned to him, unbidden and chilling, as if it had been waiting for him to remember. As the tune echoed in his mind, a faint humming sound began to fill the room. It wasn't coming from him. Panicked, David turned toward the wardrobe. The door was now wide open, revealing not the empty wooden interior he expected, but a passage, a narrow, spiraling staircase descending into darkness. The humming grew louder, a dissonant harmony that made his skin crawl. He felt compelled to move closer, his body acting against his will. As he peered into the abyss, he caught a glimpse of something moving far below, a figure barely visible, but unmistakably there. He stumbled back, clutching the locket tightly in his fist. The air in the room had grown heavier, oppressive, as though it were trying to smother him. The lamp on the bedside table flickered violently before extinguishing altogether, plunging the room into darkness. Only the faint glow from the locket remained, illuminating his trembling hands. A sudden knock shattered the silence, echoing through the room like a gunshot. It came from the wardrobe. David froze, his mind racing. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knock came again, slower this time, more deliberate. Then came a voice, soft, familiar, and yet impossibly wrong. "David, come home." It was his mother's voice, but distorted, as if filtered through layers of static and time. The wardrobe's staircase now seemed alive, its steps creaking as though someone, or something, was climbing toward him. David backed away, his heart pounding, until his legs hit the edge of the bed. He tried to remind himself that this couldn't be real, but the locket in his hand grew unbearably hot, searing his palm. He dropped it instinctively, and it clattered to the floor, its glow extinguished. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness now complete. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was waiting, pregnant with the promise of something worse. David fumbled for the lamp, desperate for light, when a faint glow returned, not from the lamp, but from the wardrobe. The staircase shimmered faintly, and from its depths came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Each step was punctuated by the hum of that cursed tune, now deafeningly loud. As the figure ascended, David could make out its outline, a woman in a tattered dress, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on invisible strings. Her face remained shrouded in shadow, but her eyes burned with a light that pierced through the darkness, locking onto David with a recognition that sent ice through his veins. She stopped at the threshold of the wardrobe, tilting her head as if studying him. Then, in a voice that echoed both his mother's and something far older, she whispered, "You've come back." "It's time." David's mind raced, pieces of his forgotten past snapping into place. His mother had always avoided speaking about her family, dismissing his questions with vague excuses. But now he understood. This place, this inn, was tied to his bloodline, and it had been waiting for his return. He realized with growing horror that he wasn't just a guest here. He was part of the story, one that had been unfolding long before he was born. The figure in the wardrobe reached out, her icy hand beckoning him forward. Behind her, the staircase spiraled endlessly downward, its depths filled with whispers and shadows. David knew that stepping forward meant uncovering truths he might never escape, but staying meant surrendering to a terror he couldn't comprehend. As the figure's hand drew closer, frost began to creep across the floor toward him, and the locket on the ground began to glow once more, pulsing like a heartbeat calling him to face his past. David's pulse thundered in his ears as the frost crept closer, tendrils of ice reaching for his feet like claws. The figure in the wardrobe remained still, her hand outstretched, but there was something predatory in the way her head tilted, as if savoring his fear. The staircase behind her seemed to shift and ripple, no longer confined by logic or geometry. Its steps wound into an infinite blackness from which faint whispers rose, voices layered atop one another, pleading, threatening, and weeping. As David stood paralyzed, the locket on the ground began to glow brighter, casting faint, pulsating light across the room. Each pulse seemed to echo in his chest, a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. But it wasn't just light. The glow was accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor and into his bones. The sound grew louder, drowning out the whispers, until a voice erupted from the locket, clear and anguished. "David, don't follow her." It was his mother's voice, unmistakable, but filled with a desperation he had never heard before. The figure in the wardrobe stiffened, her glowing eyes narrowing as the voice rang out. "She lied to you," the figure hissed, her voice a cold, serpentine rasp. "Your mother kept secrets. Secrets she couldn't bury forever." The locket's glow dimmed, flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its strength. David's mind raced, torn between the conflicting forces vying for his attention. The figure stepped out of the wardrobe, her movements sharp and unnatural, like a puppet dragged by invisible strings. The frost beneath her feet spread faster, its crystalline fingers snaking across the room. She extended her other hand, and a small object materialized in her grasp, a fragment of a photograph, weathered and torn. David squinted, his breath catching in his throat. The fragment depicted a young boy standing in front of the inn. His own face stared back at him, frozen in a moment he had no memory of. "You were here before," the figure whispered, her tone almost tender. "This place was part of you long before you could understand. Your mother tried to protect you, but she couldn't erase the truth. It's time to finish what she started." The room seemed to close in around him, the air heavy and oppressive. The frost had reached the bedposts, creeping upward like skeletal hands. David felt the weight of the figure's gaze, her glowing eyes drilling into him, but his focus was drawn back to the locket. Its light pulsed faintly now, as if weakened by the encroaching frost, but the warmth it emitted was unmistakable. The voice returned, softer this time, trembling with urgency. "You must destroy it. The locket holds the truth, but it also binds you here. Destroy it." David's stomach churned at the thought. The locket was the only tangible connection he had to his mother, the only thread tying him to the memories of her lullabies, her comforting touch. But the figure's words gnawed at him as well. What truth had his mother hidden? What was she so desperate to keep him from knowing? The whispers from the staircase grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging him toward the wardrobe. "Step forward," they pleaded, each voice layered with both desperation and menace. "You can end this. You can be free." The figure extended her hand further, her movements jerky but insistent. "The choice is yours, David," she hissed. "Come with me, and you'll know everything. Stay, and you'll lose it all." The frost now circled his feet, and a sharp, burning cold pierced his skin. He cried out, stumbling backward, his heel striking the glowing locket. The impact sent a crack spidering through the locket's surface, and the room erupted into chaos. The walls trembled, the chandelier above swayed violently, and the whispers turned into anguished screams. David fell to his knees, clutching the locket with shaking hands. He felt its warmth fading, its glow dimming. The figure in the wardrobe screeched, a sound so inhuman it clawed at his mind. Her glowing eyes flared, and she lunged forward, closing the gap between them in an instant. "Decide," she roared, her voice reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. David's thoughts raced as he weighed his impossible choice. If he destroyed the locket, he would sever his connection to his mother forever, erasing the last piece of her he had left. But if he stepped into the wardrobe, he would descend into a darkness he couldn't comprehend, bound to secrets that could consume him. The frost began to climb his legs, biting and numbing his flesh, while the voices from the staircase grew more frenzied, their words dissolving into incoherent screams. Tears streamed down David's face as he gripped the locket tighter. His mother's voice echoed one last time, faint and almost drowned out by the chaos. "David, I'm sorry, but you must choose." With a guttural scream, David made his decision. He raised the locket high above his head and brought it crashing down onto the floor. The moment the locket shattered, the room exploded in blinding light. The frost dissolved instantly, and the figure let out a deafening shriek as her body disintegrated into a cascade of ash and shadows. The staircase in the wardrobe collapsed inward, spiraling into an abyss that consumed itself. David was thrown backward, slamming into the wall as the light dimmed. When he opened his eyes, the room was eerily quiet. The frost was gone, the wardrobe stood empty, and the photograph fragment had vanished. Only the shards of the locket remained, their faint glow flickering like the dying embers of a fire. David's body trembled as he stood, his mind reeling from the weight of what he had done. He stared at the shattered locket, a hollow ache blooming in his chest. Whatever truth it had held was gone now, lost to the void. And yet, as he gazed out the window at the still raging storm, he couldn't shake the feeling that his choice had only delayed the inevitable. The inn still stood, its secrets lingering in the shadows, waiting for another soul to stumble into its grasp. David stumbled out of the room, his legs barely able to carry him as he fled the suffocating silence that had swallowed the space behind him. The hallway was impossibly dark, its only light emanating from a series of flickering sconces that seemed to retreat further into the distance with each step he took. The storm outside had intensified, the howling wind merging with the low hum of something unnatural, something alive, within the inn itself. It was no longer just a storm. It was a presence, pressing against the fragile walls of reality, straining to break through. The whispers began as faint murmurs, barely audible over the creaking floorboards. At first, David thought it was the wind playing tricks on his mind, but as he moved deeper into the corridor, the voices grew more distinct. They weren't random noises, they were words, spoken in a language he couldn't understand yet somehow instinctively feared. The syllables were sharp and guttural, like the scraping of metal against bone, and they filled the air with a weight that made it harder to breathe. He turned a corner, his hand brushing the icy wooden railing of the staircase that spiraled downward into the belly of the inn. The whispers seemed to follow him, moving just out of reach, always a step ahead or behind. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements disjointed and unnatural, as if mocking his every motion. David's heart pounded as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing, but his mind offered no explanation. The shadows were alive, shifting and writhing, as though they were trying to break free from the surfaces they were bound to. As he reached the landing, a particularly loud whisper brushed against his ear, the sensation cold and wet, like breath escaping from a drowned corpse. He whipped around, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling, swallowed by the dense air around him. The only response was a sudden, oppressive silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the sconces. For a moment he thought he might be alone, but then the whispers resumed, closer this time, and with them came something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed from the far end of the corridor, where the light from the sconces failed to reach. David squinted, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness, but the shadows seemed to thicken, resisting his gaze. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by the slow, deliberate sound of something dragging across the floor. It was coming closer. His pulse quickened as his mind conjured images of what could be lurking in the darkness, but the reality that emerged was far worse. Out of the blackness crawled a figure, its shape twisted and unnatural. Its limbs were elongated, bending at impossible angles, and its movements were agonizingly slow, as though every motion brought it unbearable pain. The tapping came from its fingers, long and skeletal, which it used to drag itself forward. Its head hung low, obscured by a curtain of damp, matted hair that clung to its face like a shroud. As it moved closer, David noticed that its shadow didn't match its body. Instead, it stretched across the wall, taking on a grotesque, amorphous shape that writhed independently, as if it were alive. Paralyzed by terror, David backed away, his foot catching on the edge of the staircase. He nearly fell, but caught himself on the railing just in time. The figure stopped abruptly, its head snapping upward with a sickening crack. From beneath the veil of hair, two glowing orbs stared at him, eyes that burned with an unnatural light, devoid of humanity. A voice, raspy and broken, emerged from its unmoving lips, speaking his name in a haunting, sing-song tone. David. The sound sent ice through his veins. How did it know his name? He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The whispers around him grew louder, more insistent, overlapping into a chaotic chorus that seemed to come from every corner of the inn. The shadows on the walls surged toward him, their shapes twisting into grotesque forms that mimicked the figure in the corridor. He could feel their cold presence pressing against his skin, pulling at his very being. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, faster than anything so broken should have been able to move. David threw himself backward, tumbling down the staircase and landing hard on the floor below. Pain shot through his body, but he barely had time to register it before the whispers converged into a single, deafening scream. The shadows descended upon him, swirling like a storm, their icy tendrils clawing at his face and arms. Desperate, David scrambled to his feet and bolted down another hallway, his vision blurred by fear and pain. The inn seemed to shift around him, the walls narrowing and twisting, as though the building itself were alive, trying to trap him. The whispers returned, this time forming words he could understand. "You cannot escape. You belong here." He burst through a doorway at the end of the hall, slamming it shut behind him. The room was pitch black, save for a faint glow emanating from the center. As his eyes adjusted, he saw what appeared to be a large mirror, its surface rippling like water. The whispers were loudest here, emanating from the mirror itself. He stepped closer, compelled by a force he couldn't resist, and as he peered into the glass, his reflection began to change. The figure in the mirror was not him. It was something else, something darker. Its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of his own, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the creature upstairs. The reflection grinned, its teeth jagged and sharp, as it reached out a hand toward him. David stumbled back, but the surface of the mirror rippled, and the hand emerged, clawing at the air between them. The door behind him creaked open, and David knew, without looking, that the creature from the corridor had found him. He was trapped, caught between two horrors with no way out. The whispers reached a crescendo, their voices filled with mocking laughter, as the hand from the mirror grew closer. David could feel his sanity slipping, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was the sound of his own voice, echoing from the mirror, "Welcome home." David's breath came in shallow gasps as he staggered away from the mirror, the cold tendrils of fear gripping his mind tighter with every step. His surroundings felt unreal, walls warped and stretched, the dim light from unseen sources casting jagged, unsteady shadows that danced like grotesque puppets. The whispers had softened, but they didn't vanish. Instead, they lingered in the edges of his consciousness, murmuring things he couldn't fully understand, yet instinctively feared. Each word seemed to peel back a layer of his thoughts, exposing his darkest memories and most primal anxieties. He stumbled into a large hall, its ceiling arching impossibly high, disappearing into shadows. A massive chandelier hung above, its frosted crystals swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. The space was eerily still, but David's skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The air was heavy, carrying a metallic tang that reminded him of blood. At the center of the hall stood a grand piano, its black surface polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting distorted images of the room. Drawn to the piano against his will, David approached cautiously. As he drew closer, his reflection on its surface twisted and contorted, showing him not as he was, but as he feared he might become, hollow-eyed, gaunt, his features warped with terror and despair. A shiver ran down his spine as the piano began to play by itself, each note resonating with an unnatural clarity. The melody was hauntingly familiar, the same lullaby his mother used to hum during snowstorms. As the song played, the hall transformed around him. The walls melted into a shifting tableau of memories, scenes from his childhood, each more vivid and unsettling than the last. He saw himself as a boy, sitting by the fire, his mother's shadow looming large against the flickering flames. But her face was obscured, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on invisible strings. The melody faltered, replaced by dissonant, jarring notes, and the memories turned darker. He saw himself running through a snowy forest, the trees closing in around him like skeletal hands. A figure loomed behind him, its breath visible in the freezing air, but no matter how fast he ran, it was always just out of sight. The whispers returned, louder now, and with them came a voice, his own voice, distorted and mocking. "You can't escape. You never could." The piano fell silent, and the hall was plunged into an oppressive stillness. David turned away from the piano, only to find the hall no longer empty. Shadows emerged from the walls, coalescing into vaguely human forms. Their features were blurred, but their presence was suffocating, their cold gazes fixed on him. One stepped forward, its outline flickering like a flame about to be extinguished. It raised an arm and pointed directly at David, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate inside his skull. "Your fear sustains us," it said, the words dripping with malice. "Do you feel it? The weight of your failure? The shadows in your mind, waiting to consume you?" David tried to speak, but his throat felt constricted, his voice strangled by the terror tightening around him. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. "You've always been afraid," it continued, circling him slowly. "Afraid of the truth, of what lies beyond the veil. Afraid of yourself." The shadows began to change, their forms becoming more distinct. They mirrored people he once knew, his childhood friends, his father, and even his mother. But their faces were wrong, their expressions frozen in masks of fear and torment. One by one, they whispered his name, their voices filled with accusation and despair. He staggered backward, clutching his head as the voices grew louder. They weren't just calling to him, they were pulling him, dragging him deeper into his own mind. He felt himself sinking, falling into an abyss of his own making. And then, amidst the cacophony, a single voice broke through the noise. It was calm, almost tender, but laced with unmistakable malice. "Let go, David. Let the fear take you. It's the only way to be free." He looked up to find himself standing before a massive, cracked mirror that hadn't been there moments ago. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his reflection. It was something else, something darker. The figure in the glass was grinning, its eyes glowing faintly. "Give in," it said, mimicking his voice perfectly. "All you have to do is accept it. Stop fighting." David felt the pull of the mirror, its surface rippling as if inviting him to step through. His fear was overwhelming, suffocating, but he knew that crossing the threshold would mean losing himself forever. He glanced back at the shadows, their forms writhing as they whispered his name over and over. The mirror's voice grew insistent. "They will never leave you. The whispers, the memories, the pain, it's all a part of you now. Embrace it, and the fear will end." His mind raced, torn between the promise of release and the dread of what lay beyond. The room began to close in around him, the shadows pressing closer, their cold touch seeping into his skin. The mirror rippled again, and for a brief moment, David thought he saw his mother on the other side, her face filled with sadness. She mouthed a single word, "Run." But there was nowhere to run. The hall had transformed into an endless expanse of darkness, the shadows consuming everything. The piano had vanished, the walls had dissolved, and the only light came from the fractured mirror. David stood frozen, the weight of his fear pressing him down like an anchor. The reflection in the glass reached out, its hand breaking through the surface. He closed his eyes, clenching his fists as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Then, with every ounce of strength he had left, he shouted into the void, "You won't take me." The shadows recoiled, the mirror shattered, and the hall was engulfed in blinding light. When David opened his eyes, he was alone once more, the oppressive silence replaced by the faint sound of the storm outside. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in his chest that he knew he would carry forever. The temptation had passed, but the battle was far from over. The air was suffocatingly still, as if the entire inn was holding its breath. David stood in the center of the crumbling room, his hands trembling as he clutched the remains of the shattered locket. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that carried more menace than the voices ever could. The walls around him seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive, their surface shifting like the skin of some enormous, unseen creature. The temperature plummeted, and frost crept along the edges of the room, encasing the floor in a brittle sheet of ice. A low, guttural growl reverberated from the darkness ahead, rattling the very foundation of the inn. David's chest tightened, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as the sound grew louder, closer. He instinctively backed away, his boots skidding on the frozen floor. A shadow began to take shape before him, coalescing into a massive, towering form. The figure was barely human, its body an amalgamation of jagged ice and shifting shadows. Its head was crowned with a halo of frost, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural blue light that pierced through the darkness like twin beacons. "You should never have come here," the entity rumbled, its voice echoing with an otherworldly cadence that made David's bones ache. "This place is not yours to claim. It belongs to me, and so do you." The entity stepped forward, its weightless form gliding across the floor with a predatory grace. With each step, the frost spread further, creeping up the walls and ceiling, transforming the room into an icy tomb. David felt the temperature drop further, his breath freezing in midair. His body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming presence of the being before him. It wasn't just physical, it pressed against his mind, invading his thoughts with visions of torment and despair. Memories he had buried long ago began to surface against his will. He saw himself as a child, standing in a snow-covered yard, watching his mother through the window. She had been crying, her hands clutching something, a piece of paper, perhaps, or a photograph. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. The memory shifted, and David was back at the inn, a younger version of himself running through the halls, his laughter echoing through the corridors. But he wasn't alone. A shadow loomed behind him, its icy hand reaching out, almost grazing his shoulder. "You were marked from the beginning," the entity said, its voice pulling David back to the present. "Your mother thought she could protect you. She thought she could keep you from me. But fear is eternal, and it has always been mine." David clenched his fists, forcing himself to speak through the terror constricting his throat. "Why me? What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. The entity tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You already know the answer," it replied. With a wave of its hand, the ice on the floor shifted, revealing an intricate pattern carved into its surface. The design was a labyrinth of symbols, spiraling inward to form a single name etched in the center, David Frost. The sight of his own name, frozen into the very fabric of the room, sent a shockwave of dread through him. He stumbled back, shaking his head. "No, this isn't possible. I've never been here before." "Lies," the entity hissed, its voice sharp as shattered glass. "You were born of this place. Your blood carries its curse. You cannot deny what you are." The frost beneath David's feet began to crack, the sound echoing like thunder in the vast emptiness of the room. He looked down in horror as the ice split apart, revealing a chasm below, a swirling vortex of darkness and light, filled with the faces of countless souls. They screamed silently, their mouths open in endless agony as they were pulled deeper into the void. The sight was maddening, and David felt his sanity slipping as the vortex reached for him, icy tendrils brushing against his legs. "Choose," the entity commanded, its voice reverberating through the room. "Surrender yourself to me, and I will grant you peace. Resist, and you will share their fate." David's mind raced, his heart pounding as he realized the gravity of the choice before him. The locket in his hand began to hum faintly, its shattered pieces vibrating with an energy that felt both foreign and familiar. He glanced at it, the glow of its fragments casting fleeting shadows on his face. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, faint but resolute. "You are stronger than this place. You are stronger than him." Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, David took a step forward, clutching the locket tightly. The entity's glowing eyes flared with anger as it sensed his defiance. "Foolish," it snarled. "Do you think a broken trinket can save you?" "It's not the locket," David said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "It's the memory. It's the love, and you'll never take that from me." With that, he hurled the shattered locket into the vortex. The room erupted in a blinding light, the symbols on the ice burning away as the void began to collapse. The entity screamed, its form disintegrating into shards of frost and shadow, carried away by the imploding vortex. The inn itself groaned and trembled, its walls cracking and splintering as the very foundation of the place unraveled. David was thrown to the ground as the light consumed everything. For a moment, he felt weightless, suspended in a sea of warmth and light. The whispers were gone, replaced by a serene silence. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. When he opened his eyes, David was lying in the snow outside the inn. The building was gone, leaving only an empty clearing surrounded by silent, snow-laden trees. The storm had stopped, and the sky above was clear, the stars shining down like distant, watchful eyes. David sat up, his breath visible in the crisp night air. In his hand, he still held a fragment of the locket, its glow faint but steady. The terror of the inn lingered in his mind, a scar that would never fully heal. But as he rose to his feet and began walking down the mountain, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The entity was gone, its oppressive presence dissolved into the night, and the inn no longer loomed behind him. David stood in the clearing, the silence pressing against his ears like a heavy blanket. For the first time, he realized the cold wasn't as biting as before. The frost that had clung to his skin, to his soul, seemed to have retreated along with the darkness. He looked down at the fragment of the locket in his hand, its faint glow pulsing like a dying ember. It felt warm now, not cold as it had in the inn. As he traced its jagged edges, he thought of his mother, her face, her voice, her desperate attempts to protect him from a truth she had carried alone. The memories no longer felt oppressive. Instead, they anchored him, a reminder of the love that had endured even the cold grasp of the entity. David began to walk, his steps unsteady at first, crunching against the snow that blanketed the forest floor. The storm clouds had parted, revealing a sky strewn with stars. The moon hung low, its light illuminating the trees around him, their branches no longer reaching like claws, but standing as silent sentinels. The path ahead was clearer now, the shadows less menacing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the inn hadn't truly disappeared. It had simply receded, waiting for its next victim. As he descended the mountain, the whispers faintly returned, not from the inn or the shadows, but from within his own mind. They weren't malicious now, but soft, reflective, as though they carried the remnants of all those who had been consumed by the inn's curse. Faces flashed in his memory, distorted, lost, pleading. He realized then that the entity hadn't just fed on fear. It had thrived on isolation, on the vulnerability of those who had no one to turn to. And yet, he had survived. His survival wasn't just a matter of luck or strength. It was a testament to the connections he carried, the fragments of love and memory that the entity couldn't devour. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his mind, a soft reminder of her sacrifice and her enduring presence. "You are stronger than this place," she had said. He now understood what she meant. The clearing gave way to the forest path, and soon David could see the faint outline of his abandoned car in the distance. It was coated in a thin layer of snow, the windows frosted over, but it stood as a beacon of normalcy amidst the madness he had endured. The locket fragment in his hand pulsed one last time, its glow fading entirely. He clutched it tightly, a piece of the past that would never fully let him go. As he reached his car and opened the door, he glanced back at the path behind him. The forest stood still, blanketed in an almost serene silence. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered just beyond the treeline, watching, waiting. The inn might have been destroyed, but its echoes remained, a scar on the land and on his soul. David climbed into the car, turned the key, and was relieved when the engine sputtered to life. The heater roared to life, chasing away the last remnants of the cold. He sat there for a moment, staring at the road ahead, the weight of everything he had seen and felt settling over him. The terror, the choices, the voices, they would haunt him forever, but they wouldn't define him. As he drove down the mountain, the faintest hint of dawn began to break on the horizon. The light was pale and cold, but it was a promise, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there was a way forward. David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his resolve growing stronger with each mile that took him further from the nightmare. Behind him, deep in the forest, the clearing where the inn once stood remained empty. The frost had melted, the air now still and quiet. But if one were to listen closely, on the coldest nights when the wind carried a certain chill, they might hear faint whispers rising from the snow. Whispers that spoke of fear, of memory, and of an inn that waited patiently for its next unwitting guest. The cold air burned David's lungs as he stood at the center of the inn's grand hall, the frost-covered walls now alive with pulsating veins of ice that seemed to feed on his fear. The shattered locket fragments in his hand pulsed weakly, their faint glow flickering like a dying star. The oppressive presence of the entity filled the room, an invisible force that made the air heavier with every passing second. It was everywhere and nowhere, its voice a low rumble that emanated from the very structure of the inn. "You think you can defy me?" the entity growled, its voice rolling like distant thunder. The shadows around the room began to ripple and coalesce, forming shapes that mirrored David's deepest fears. Figures from his past, faces of those he'd loved and lost, all twisted into grotesque forms. Each figure advanced, their distorted features frozen in expressions of pain and accusation. The entity spoke again, its voice dripping with malice. "You carry your fear like a badge, David. It is mine. You are mine." The air grew colder, frost creeping up David's legs, freezing him in place. The figures reached for him, their icy hands stretching out with unnatural slowness, as if savoring his terror. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee, but his body was frozen, not by the ice, but by the overwhelming weight of dread that pressed against his very soul. Then, in the heart of the suffocating silence, a flicker of warmth stirred within him. The locket fragments glowed brighter, their light steadying as if responding to his will. The melody his mother used to hum, soft, haunting, echoed faintly in his mind. It wasn't just a memory, it was a lifeline, a thread connecting him to something stronger than fear. He gripped the fragments tighter, the warmth spreading through his fingertips and up his arm, defying the icy grip of the shadows. "I'm not yours," David whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "Not now. Not ever." The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms flickering like candle flames caught in a sudden gust. The entity roared, its voice shaking the room, and the frost on the walls spread rapidly, forming jagged spikes that jetted out like teeth. "You cannot escape me," it bellowed. "This place is part of you. You are nothing without it." The frost tightened around David's legs, climbing higher, but he fought against it, forcing himself to move. Each step forward was a battle, his body screaming in protest as the ice clawed at him. The locket fragments grew brighter, their light pushing back the encroaching darkness. The melody in his mind grew louder, stronger, and with it came a surge of defiance. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the memory of his mother, for the countless souls consumed by the inn's curse. Ahead of him, the shadows parted, revealing the heart of the entity, a swirling vortex of frost and shadow suspended in the center of the hall. Its form was unstable, constantly shifting, but its glowing eyes burned like twin suns, fixed on David with an intensity that threatened to consume him. The vortex pulsed with power, and the walls of the inn trembled as if alive, their structure groaning under the weight of the entity's fury. David raised the fragments of the locket, their glow now almost blinding. The warmth coursing through him pushed back the cold, and for the first time, he saw the entity falter. It let out a guttural roar, its form flickering and distorting as the light struck it. "You cannot destroy me," it howled. "I am fear itself. I am eternal." "No," David said, his voice steady. "You're not eternal. You're just a parasite, feeding on the pain of others. And I'm done feeding you." With a surge of strength, he hurled the locket fragments into the heart of the vortex. The light exploded outward, piercing through the frost and shadows, and the room was filled with a deafening scream as the entity writhed and contorted, its form breaking apart like shards of glass caught in a storm. The frost covering the walls and floor began to crack and melt, the ice dissolving into steam as the oppressive cold lifted. The inn itself began to collapse, the walls crumbling inward as the foundation gave way. David stumbled backward, shielding his eyes from the blinding light emanating from the vortex. The shadows dissolved into nothingness, and the figures that had tormented him faded into mist, their anguished faces replaced with expressions of peace. The entity let out one final, bone-chilling scream before it imploded, collapsing into a singular point of light that blinked out of existence. The inn fell silent, its structure dissolving into ash that was carried away by an unseen wind. David fell to his knees, the weight of what had just transpired crashing over him like a wave. The locket fragments were gone, but the warmth they had left behind lingered in his chest, a reminder of the love and strength that had carried him through. As the light faded, David found himself kneeling in the snow outside the inn. The building was gone, its presence erased as if it had never existed. The forest around him was still, the air crisp and clear. The storm had passed, and the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a golden light across the snow. David rose to his feet, his breath visible in the cold air. He felt hollow but not broken. The fear that had once consumed him was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He turned away from the empty clearing, the weight of the past lifted from his shoulders, and began walking down the mountain. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence, but deep in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't truly gone. It had been defeated, but fear always finds a way to return. The snow-covered mountain stood eerily quiet, bathed in the pale light of dawn. David trudged down the path, each step leaving faint imprints in the unbroken snow. His body ached, the weight of his ordeal pressing down on him like an invisible chain. Though the inn had crumbled into nothingness, its memory lingered, clinging to him like frost that refused to thaw. He gripped his arms tightly, trying to steady himself against the cold, not the cold of the mountain, but a deeper chill, one that seemed to seep from his very soul. As the forest began to thin, David allowed himself to look back one last time. The clearing where the inn had once stood was now a lifeless expanse of snow and silence. Nothing remained, not the towering walls, the frost-laden halls, or the malevolent shadows that had haunted him. And yet, there was something unsettling in its emptiness. The snow had smoothed over the ground too quickly, as though the land was eager to erase the inn's existence. But David knew better. The inn wasn't gone. Not really. Its essence lingered, waiting, biding its time. A faint wind stirred the branches above him, carrying a sound that made him stop in his tracks. It wasn't the howl of the mountain breeze or the rustle of shifting snow. It was a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably familiar. David turned his head sharply, his pulse quickening as he scanned the forest around him. The trees stood motionless, their skeletal branches reaching skyward like silent sentinels. But the whisper came again, clearer this time, and with it came the unmistakable sensation of being watched. "David," the voice called, faint but insidious, weaving itself into the wind. It wasn't a single voice but a chorus, layered, dissonant, and filled with a chilling familiarity. It wasn't coming from a single direction, it surrounded him, as though the forest itself had come alive to mock him. His grip tightened on the strap of his bag, his knuckles white as he forced himself to keep moving. He wouldn't give in to the fear. Not again. But as he pressed forward, the forest seemed to shift around him. The trees grew denser, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches forming a canopy that choked out the light of dawn. The path he had been following began to fade, swallowed by the encroaching snow. David glanced over his shoulder and saw nothing but an endless expanse of white and shadow. It was as if the mountain was conspiring to keep him there, to pull him back into its icy grip. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and with them came the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and too close for comfort. David's heart raced as he turned, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. He swallowed hard, his breath visible in the freezing air, and forced himself to speak. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound firm. There was no answer, just the hum, growing louder, and then a sharp crack as one of the nearby trees split open. David stumbled back, his eyes widening as a torrent of black, tar-like liquid spilled from the jagged trunk. The liquid writhed unnaturally, forming shapes that were both human and not, faces that screamed silently before dissolving into formless shadows. The whispers returned, louder now, their words incomprehensible but laced with malice. David turned and ran, his boots crunching against the snow as he fled deeper into the forest. The landscape twisted and warped around him, the trees closing in like prison bars. The whispers pursued him, mingling with mocking laughter and faint echoes of his own voice. "You thought it was over," the voices taunted, overlapping and distorted. "You thought you could leave." He burst into another clearing, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. The air here was unnaturally still, and the snow beneath his feet shimmered faintly, as though infused with some otherworldly energy. In the center of the clearing stood a single object, a mirror, tall and cracked, its surface rippling like water. David froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. The mirror was identical to the one he had seen in the inn, the one that had almost consumed him. As he approached cautiously, the surface of the mirror began to change. At first, it reflected only the trees and snow, but then his own image appeared, distorted and wrong. The reflection grinned, its eyes glowing faintly, and spoke in his voice. "You never left, David. You never will." David stumbled back, shaking his head. "No," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I destroyed you. You're gone." The reflection's grin widened, and the glass of the mirror began to crack, each fissure spreading outward like a spiderweb. "Fear doesn't die," it said, the voice reverberating through the clearing. "It simply waits." The crack spread further, and the mirror shattered with a deafening sound, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. David shielded his face, expecting to feel the sting of the fragments, but when he opened his eyes, the mirror was gone. The clearing was empty again, silent and still. He stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, unsure if what he had seen was real or another trick of his mind. He turned and resumed his descent, the path reappearing beneath his feet as the forest began to thin once more. The whispers faded, replaced by the distant sound of the wind. But deep down, David knew the truth. The inn might have been destroyed, but the entity wasn't gone. It was part of the mountain, part of the fear that had gripped him, and it would wait, as it always had, for someone else to stumble into its grasp. As he reached his car and opened the door, David cast one last glance at the mountain. The morning light bathed the peaks in gold, but the shadows that clung to its slopes seemed darker, deeper, as if they held secrets that no light could penetrate. He drove away, the inn and its horrors disappearing in the rearview mirror, but the question lingered in his mind. Had he truly escaped? Or had the inn left something behind, buried deep within him, waiting for its moment to resurface?